we continue our work in the framework of our model, European Immigration and Public Policy. And I'm really honored to invite to deliver a guest lecture about digital transformation, media, information landscape, and all related EU policies. Our excellent speaker, Sofia Verza, who was invited just recently to give a lecture, but still I believe in your strong expertise. And Sofia, if you can share a bit about yourself, you're welcome. And of course, the stage is yours. So this 1 hour and a half is fully for you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to you, Alexandra, and it's really nice to meet you all. It's an honor for me to be here today. So I'm Sofia Verza. I'm a research associate at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom. We are based in Florence at the European University Institute, where also Costanza, who was here earlier, is based. I am based in Italy, and I'm also Italian. I would like to start this lesson with also the help of some slides. If you agree, I will share my screen. And
yeah,
I
invite.
Great.
Valeria, is it possible?
I think so. I can find
yeah,
this
okay.
option.
Yeah, usually we do that from the beginning.
Thanks. And feel free to interrupt me if there is something that is not clear for you, but unless it is very, very urgent, otherwise please leave it to the end. But if there is something that is really not clear, please feel free to interrupt me. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Yes, for now, yes.
Super. Okay. So, what I would like to speak about with you today are the concepts of media freedom at large, and more specifically, the media policies that are being adopted in the European Union in the last few years in the field of media and digital media especially. Before getting to the policies in themselves, I would like to share with you some of the results of a project that is called Media Pluralism Monitor that our center runs since 2014. So it is now 12 years that we run this project. And specifically, this project is focusing on a series of indicators that are being analyzed by researchers that are based in all the 27 EU member states, which are involved in this study, but also in all the candidate countries. And since 3 years, we also have a researcher that is Ukrainian. Now she's not based anymore in Ukraine. Her name is Daria Opishko, and I will share with you the link to read a report on media pluralism in Ukraine later on. So this is the series of indicators that we are looking into for running this study. As you see, they are divided in 4 main areas of analysis. The fundamental protection area, which I will focus upon especially today. The market plurality area, where we look at the state of the media market in each of these countries. The independence from political pressures and political influences of the media. and the social inclusiveness of the media, so specifically their capacity of being inclusive towards minorities and marginalized communities, and also to cover smaller local areas. And we also look into the situation for media literacy. As I told you, for today, we will focus on the area of fundamental protection, and we share with you some results. But before jumping there, I would like to focus upon the concept of media pluralism, which is in the title of our project. So what is it meant in the scientific literature by media pluralism? So media pluralism can be subdivided into three main concepts. The concept of external pluralism that has to do especially with having a plural structure of the media market. So having a diverse number of media actors in the market and not a very concentrated market in the hands of a few owners. Then you can look at this concept from the perspective of internal pluralism, which refers instead to a plurality of content and viewpoints within also one single media outlet. So the fact that a single media outlet is providing voice to different subjects and different viewpoints. And then finally, and this is a concept that has been elaborated pretty recently, we have the concept of exposure diversity. Why this has been elaborated recently? Because it has to do very much with the digital transition of information and news communication. So exposure diversity indicates the variety of content to which users are exposed to online. As you know, you might have heard about the concept of, for example, filter bubble or echo chamber. So the fact that our digital news diet might be very, biased towards our preferences, and we might not be exposed to all the possible plural viewpoints that are instead existing, let's say, in real world. So to share with you some of the results of the fundamental protection area of the Media Pluralism Monitor, we will look into these 5 dimensions. So the protection of freedom of expression in the EU countries and candidate countries, the protection of information integrity, which looks especially into the online space, the protection of the right to information, so the right to access information by citizens and by journalists themselves, the situation for the journalistic profession, so for example, the safety of journalists and their working conditions, and the independence and effectiveness of the national regulatory authorities, especially the media authorities in the states under analysis. So when we look into the protection of freedom of expression in our monitor, we look into the respect of international standards for freedom of expression, especially we look at the European Convention for Human Rights and the respect for its obligations. We look if in the countries under studies there is a balance between the protection of dignity and the protection of freedom of expression. This is the case, for example, when we look into defamation-related law, insults, libel, all these laws where there is a balance between what one is entrusted to say and the honor of the person that is involved in this communication. And positive obligations. It means what states should do to guarantee freedom of expression in their own country. And here I mentioned SLAPs. We will look into this a bit further. So SLAP is an acronym that means Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. These are lawsuits that are brought usually by powerful actors like businessmen or politicians in power against journalists or civil society organizations, or in any case, watchdogs, in a way that is constructed to push these watchdogs to self-censorship. So basically to scare them with with the request of very high fees, or even in cases of defamation in the countries where defamation is still criminalized, with possible detention penalties. So when we look into this, one of the main results that I would like to share with you are, okay, in this image you see some levels of risk, because what our instrument does is to evaluate the risks for media pluralism in each country. And here you can see that they vary from very low risk to very high risk. This data, I must also specify that these data refer to 2024, because every year we analyze the previous year. So these results are from our MPM 2025, and in June of 2026, we will publish the results for the year 2025. So the main result for this indicator that I would like to share with you.
I'm sorry,
yes?
we still see the indicator slide and not the graphic you showed.
Oh, okay. So you don't see my screen in, you don't see the full screen, right?
No, now you're switching slides so we can see.
Okay, so this is not what I also see. That's strange. I see another page. I'm sorry. Thank you for noticing this. Hmm. Thanks for your patience. Okay, now are you seeing a map?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, great. So wait. Slideshow. Are you now seeing a map?
Yeah, we do.
I'm not sure why I cannot show you this in the full screen, but hopefully it is still pretty visible.
Yeah, it is. It's fine.
Oh, okay,
Just
great.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the main result for what regards this indicator from our Media Pluralism Monitor 2025 is that with regards to protection of freedom of expression throughout the continent, the impact of reporting on major geopolitical issues, for example, the ongoing war of invasion on Ukraine or the genocide in Palestine is increasingly posing issues in the EU for the protection of freedom of expression and the consequences that journalists covering these specific issues are facing. So when we look into the protection of information integrity instead, you can find some results that regard the respect of freedom of expression online by very large online platforms, especially social media platforms, the respect of freedom of expression online by public authorities, and the protection against disinformation and foreign interference and manipulation online. Here again, one of the main results stemming from our study is that content moderation practices that are related to topics like ongoing conflicts have resulted in unfair content suppression in many instances, also when the content comes from journalists and media service providers. And sometimes this happens also without notifying users of this censorship taking place. And another, I guess, interesting result in this area is that half of the EU countries report not to have a public strategy against disinformation in place. And 12 countries report to have no measures to identify and address foreign interference and manipulation interference. Here we have some results for what concerns the risk for media pluralism that relate to the right to information. So the access to information by journalists through, for example, Freedom of Information Acts. So asking access to public authorities to public documents and the protection of whistleblowers. And I'm happy to dig into this later if you're curious, but I would quickly jump to the results that regard instead the independence of national regulatory authorities. So there we look especially into the competences and the accountability of these national regulatory authorities and their budgetary independence. Especially why is budgetary independence important? Because in period that when more and more competences are entrusted upon these regulators, it is very important to have strong human and technical resources within the authorities to be able to enforce all the new EU media policies that we will look a bit more in detail into later on today. So what our researchers are reporting in this field is that especially for what concerns budget, human and technical resources, there are increasing gaps. And the results of the upcoming year will be even clearer in this regard. So this is very important to keep in mind when new regulations are enacted, to also equip the regulatory authorities that will be enforced for their implementation with new resources. Finally, I want to share some results with regards the situation for the protection of journalists and the journalistic profession at large in the EU and candidate countries. So in this field, we look at working conditions, so salaries, which are very quickly decreasing for journalists throughout the EU, and their social security schemes that are in some countries basically absent, their physical and digital safety, and some instances also of surveillance on journalists. The most, let's say, scaring data that we have in this area regard the increasing risks for digital safety of journalists, also also in Western Europe. Basically, as you can see from this map, almost everywhere in Europe. There are increasing hate speech campaigns that are taking place, especially online. There are instances of spoofing and doxing. So spoofing is what is spoofing? Spoofing are attacks that involve basically the impersonification, identity disguise, or the falsification of data online to deceive and manipulate in order to also spread discredit against specific journalists. So there have been instances in Belgium, for example, in Germany as well, of deepfake, so AI-generated videos or AI-generated images of real journalists, where they are saying things that are discrediting them, but of course these were fakes. And this is taking place especially in times of high polarization, so when elections are taking place, for example. Also, there is more and more discussion in the EU about the risks that are linked with the illegitimate surveillance of journalists. So especially when it comes to the use of spywares that are softwares that can be installed in a journalist device in order to record phone calls, to read phone messages. They are very sneaky because they are very hard to detect. And there have been many instances in the last 4 or 5 years. Being Italian, I would just mention the last Italian case that has been, it emerged in January 2025 when a group of journalists from online outlet called Fanpage received a message from Meta saying that they detected spyware infection in their WhatsApp by done using an Israeli spyware that is called Graphite. Still, this case is open in front of the Italian government. There has been no official response by the government about who and how could have used this software. And why I'm especially speaking about this issue is also because, as we will see later, the newly enacted European Media Freedom Act, which is a regulation of the European Union enacted in 2024, contains an article prohibiting the use of spywares against journalists. Finally, I want to share with you some results that regard the physical safety, the situation for physical safety of journalists in the EU. As you can see in the NPM 2025 data, which then refer to 2024, 7 countries have scored as high risk with regards to the physical safety of journalists. And among them, you can also see France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and the Netherlands. This means that high numbers of physical attacks have taken place in these countries against journalists. And this especially happens during demonstrations. Especially demonstrations, again, that are taking place around very sensitive topics like environmental related topics, far-right demonstrations, and war, especially when it comes to, again, Ukraine and Palestine. Also, we need to keep in mind that 2024 was called a super election year because in almost half of the EU countries, elections took place. So polarization was extremely high in the opinion climate and in the general media sphere in the EU. So after having offered this overview of results of risks for media freedom and media pluralism in the EU, I would like to jump into attempts of solutions for this very not optimistic situation. So I would like to share with you some chronology of the actions and of the EU legal framework for the digital public sphere in particular. So I would like to start with 2015. In 2015, the European Commission published a document that is called the EU Digital Single Market Strategy, where basically for the first time it declared to the willingness of the EU to act to rebalance the great imbalance of power between trustworthy news organization and journalists and very large online platforms, especially social media platforms. Why this was really felt as urgent is that many of the issues that we spoke about earlier also deal with the fact that newsrooms and journalists, especially freelance journalists, that don't have the backup of a strong newsroom behind them are in increasingly difficult economic situations. And this is also due to digital disruption and the fact that people more and more get informed online. And the revenues and advertising revenues of these news outlets are very quickly decreasing. 1 year later, taking also into account the increasing hate speech campaigns against journalists and watchdogs throughout the continent, the EU enacted the EU Code of Conduct on Countering Illegal Hate Speech Online, and the very interesting discussions stemmed from it and are still ongoing about what has to be considered hate speech and how to counter it in a very complex environment like the online environment. On the same year, the General Data Protection Regulation, so-called GDPR, was also enacted. And this basically changed and tried to harmonize the different national regulations when it comes to to data protection and privacy. And why is this particularly important for the topic that we are discussing today? Well, this is for two reasons. One reason is related to the use of personal data of users on large platforms. So the fact that sensible personal data can or cannot be used under specific circumstances by online service providers. And the second reason why this regulation is very important is that in one specific article, which is Article 85, it provides that journalists can use personal data of the people they are reporting upon if sharing this data is important in the public interest. So what does it mean? That if I want to report on some corruption-related activities of a powerful politician, and I want to share his name or some other, personal data, I am protected by this regulation that I should not be slapped, as we were discussing earlier, that I should not be denounced for my journalistic activity. Then a couple of years later, in 2018, the revised version of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive was enacted. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive was first enacted in 2013, and then it was revised in 2018 to take into consideration also video sharing platforms, such as YouTube, for example. Then here you find some mix of EU regulations, national regulations, private regulations, and on the top line in orange color, some real world events. Why I put them there? Because I don't want to imply that real world events directly in a deterministic way cause some specific media or digital sphere related policies by the EU, but for sure they influence the pace and the speediness by which the EU started regulating the digital sphere. So in 2017, the German NetzDG law was enacted. This is the first law all over the EU, also before EU laws were enacted, that tries to control the spread of illegal content on online platforms, providing also very high fees for these online platforms in case this is not respected. The urgency of dealing with these problems became very clear in 2018 when the Cambridge Analytica scandal exploded. You might remember this scandal. Basically, what emerged there was that Cambridge Analytica, a British agency working on electoral campaigns and analysis of big data, was collaborating with, in the case of some campaigns specifically, for example, the Brexit-related campaign or the Brexit-related campaign or the first David Trump's electoral campaign. And it did so illegally scraping millions of personal data in social media platforms. So that triggered a lot of discussion and public pressure that started to shed a negative light on platforms' actions and the governance of online platforms, the urgency for this governance. So right afterwards, in 2018, the European Commission enacted the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which was then updated in 2022. And the whole situation got even more complicated from 2020 onwards because of the pandemic, and then because of the Russian war of invasion of Ukraine, and then 1 year later because of the start of the genocide in Gaza and related news. So in 2020, here I put some reminder about the establishment of an oversight board within Facebook. This is, of course, a private form of governance. What Facebook tried to do to prove that they were proactively trying to better manage the information floating in their platform was establishing an oversight board that should receive complaints by users and decide case by case on which information would be legit to maintain on their platform and which not. The EU institutions decided to directly act on this, and in 2022, two very important regulations were enacted: the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Today, we will focus especially on the Digital Services Act, which deals with content moderation related issues. But in the Digital Markets Act, if you are curious, you can have a look. There are important passages that deal with concepts like who and which platform is a gatekeeper in the online space, and big, digital monopolies and how to deal with them. but this is especially competition-related law. So if you are lovers of competition law, I suggest to dig into this act. Finally, in 2024, 3 acts were enacted, very important. Actually, I would add here live the anti-SLAPP directive, which I forgot to add. So the European Media Freedom Act, which is a regulation, we will look into this today. The Artificial Intelligence Act, this is also a regulation. The anti-SLAPP directive, which deals with exactly reckless lawsuits against watchdogs, and the EU regulation on transparency and targeting of political advertising. So the European Media Freedom Act, it's a regulation that has a scope to all kinds of media, not only audiovisual media, and this is in itself a big paradigm change. Why? Because until this moment, all the EU-wide regulations on media only looked into audiovisual media, while in this case, also the press and digital native media have been involved. So one of the aims of this regulation is to address the increasing opinion power of digital platforms, to look into the new digital economy, and to act on long-term media sustainability. Taking into consideration that there are market failures for the media market throughout the EU, that there is a great fragmentation of rules because each national state has their own competence in the media field. So this is the first regulation that acts horizontally in the media field in all the EU member states. Trying to foster an increasingly cross-border market in the media field. Also, it takes into account that up to now, there has been limited regulatory cooperation between authorities, especially media authorities, and it takes into account the need to better support media and journalists in the EU. So why is this a regulation, and what is the difference between a regulation and a directive? As I told you earlier, the only act that is a directive in the list that I was mentioning earlier, this list, is the anti-SLAPP directive. All these other acts, the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, the regulation on political advertising, they are all regulations. So what is the difference? The difference is that a regulation is directly applicable in the member states of the EU, and it is binding in its entirety, while a directive needs to be transposed by the single member states and leaves to them much more discretion as to the forms and the means to do so. So the reasons why the form, the shape, let's say the legal shape of regulation was chosen by the European institutions is the speed by which the content of this regulation can be enforced in the member states. So what are the key articles in the European Media Freedom Act? Here I did an indicative list of those that we at the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom consider as the key articles of this regulation. One deals with the prohibition of the use of spywares on journalists and their sources that we were speaking about a bit earlier. Then Article 5 deals with the need of independence of public service media of each individual member state. Then we have a provision dealing with the transparency of media ownership. It asks to each member state to establish a transparency register where it would be easily possible to find all the details of ownership related to the single media outlets present in a territory. Why is this important? Of course, to check if there are excessive concentrations of power and ownership and conflicts of interest ongoing between the ownership of a media outlet and other situations, like, for example, political roles or positions. There is an article, Article 7, that deals with the independence and the need of independence for national regulatory authorities. And in particular, it deals with the need of having enough budget and the human and technical capacities that we also mentioned earlier when looking into the NPM data. Then there is Article 18 that deals with the presence of news content in very large online platforms and how VLOPs, which is the acronym for very large online platforms, should deal with news content when the news content comes from legitimate actors, good journalists, trustworthy news outlets. Article 22 deals with the so-called media plurality test. This looks into the control of market concentrations when mergers take place. So when there is a concentration, a merger of media companies taking place, the national regulatory authorities of a specific countries should check that this merger does not infringe on media pluralism and the possibility to vehiculate diverse viewpoints in any case. And finally, another key article in our opinion is Article 25 that deals with the transparency of state advertising. So the advertising coming from state companies or state governmental institutions, which is allocated to different media outlets. We know that sometimes state advertising is allocated in a not transparent way, which leads to biases and allocation of advertising based on the political affiliation of an outlet. So also in this case, the publication of a clear registry for the allocation of state advertising is demanded by the EU regulation. What would be what is a fundamental question to be posed when looking into media policies is who are the media? Because in the current digital environment, it is very difficult to define who is a journalist and who is not. So in the European Media Freedom Act, you can find a definition at Article 2 of AMFA, where media service providers are defined as those who perform journalism as a professional activity and who have the editorial responsibility for the choice of the content and for the manner in which it is organized. So let's look into these specific definitions: professional activity and editorial responsibility. Professional activity means that writing about news and current affairs or realizing audio programs or audiovisual programs on news and current affairs is your main activity. But this does not mean that it should be remunerated. This is an important point. Why? Because otherwise, non-profit media, for example, community media organization, would be left out by the protections entrusted by the European Media Freedom Act, while this is not the case. And editorial responsibility, this is also a crucial point to define who is a media service provider, and why social media platforms are not to be considered media service providers, because they don't have the editorial responsibility of what gets published on their own platforms. They do decide how the content is organized, and we will look into this now. They do decide which news come first, what is in your feed, which content has more or less visibility, but they do not decide upon the content of a news article, which gets shared on their own platforms. So when we answer to this question, who are the media? Are they individual journalists? Yes, of course, they can be individual journalists, freelancers, even if they do not work for a newsroom specifically. They cannot be considered media when we look into social media platforms, and so-called RAG media service providers cannot be considered as media, meaning malicious actors that are not veiculating news in the public interest, but are sharing mis or disinformation. This distinction is very important when we then read the regulatory framework and understand who has some rights and who has some duties entrusted by the European regulation. Looking into the activity of online platforms especially, and the presence of news on social media platforms, it is very important to keep in mind some notions that have been considered as proved by academic literature by now. So the fact that social media have specific designs that affect users' behaviors and that tend to optimize their engagement. The fact that most of the users online encounter news incidentally, so they don't proactively look for news, especially political news online, but they encounter them by chance. And the fact that there is a sort of isomorphic relationship between news media organization and very large online platforms. This means that the more the media decide to share their content on social media platforms and to count on them for the dissemination of their content, the more they become vulnerable to the platform choices and changes of settings. So this is really key to understand some dynamics about sharing news on social media platforms, as well as it is key to focus on one specific concept, that is the concept of content moderation. So basically, the content moderation is the mechanism of removing or reducing or amplifying the visibility of content online. And this gets done by platforms following their terms of services mainly, to remove illegal content, to remove disinformation or so-called borderline content. But this gets done also by means of algorithmic personalization, as we were saying earlier, using the big data and personalized data that are scraped by our social media accounts. This content moderation is done both by human moderators, so physical persons that are hired by online platforms to do this job, but also by semi or fully automatic algorithmic systems, especially those that we can call recommender systems. here is, I hope you can see it, it's an image about how content moderation or content recommendation work. So in the beginning, you have a full, amount of content of all possible types. Then content moderation takes place. This takes place, for example, for illegal content, violent content, and it gets removed, or it gets reviewed by human moderators, which could add some warning labels or could downrank or reduce the visibility of some content. Otherwise, this content the visibility of this content is dependent on content recommendation, and this is more it more has to do with our preferences, no? Those who like dogs more than books, etc., and gets recommended certain content rather than other. So the main actions for content moderation are removal, demotions, labeling, and amplification of content. And we can look into this later if you are curious. But all this premise about these, conceptual notions is very important when we look into the governance of content moderation done in the last years by the EU. So initially, with the e-commerce directive in 2000, the EU said, no way, online service providers, they are not responsible in any possible way for the content that passes by their platforms because they are only like containers, let's say. They don't have any kind of responsibility upon what circulates in their platforms. And this was in a really early stage of, the use of online platforms for sharing news, and in a also, let's say, very optimistic stage of the perception of the internet at large. But then, life happened, and all the events that we look into earlier, Cambridge Analytica scandal, the pandemic, so on and so forth, they pushed the urgency of EU institutions for acting on also the governance of online content. And these key regulations were enacted. With regards to digital content and news, I would like to just touch upon briefly, before hearing your questions, upon two articles. One article is Article 18 of the European Media Freedom Act. So how does this work? Basically, starting from next year, actually the European Media Freedom Act is in force since August 2025, but the guidelines by the Commission to apply Article 18 have been published 2 days ago. So they're very, very recent. So what is expected is that very large online platforms, especially social media platforms, will create a specific interface for media service providers to self-declare themselves as such. So basically a box where journalists or news outlets can declare to be journalists and to be news outlets. So in case the social media platform would moderate their content, they will have a privileged procedure to follow before seeing their content removed or downranked without even, maybe knowing or noticing it. So they have a right to an expeditious explanation before the content gets removed by the platform. So basically, the platform needs to write to the media service provider and say, hey, we find this content offensive or disinformative, and we are going to remove it or downrank it. The media service provider has the right to reply to the platform's action, to lodge a complaint, and to engage in a dialogue with the platform, to appeal to the board. This board is the European Board of Media Services that is reuniting all the media authorities from the different EU member states. And also, the social media platforms are required to report on such practices on a yearly basis. So in a few years, hopefully, we will have reports by the platforms where we can see when and which news providers have been engaging in this kind of practices with social media platforms. And to conclude, I want to look into the Digital Services Act regulation, which is from 2022, but it entered into force in 2024. And this regulation applies to all intermediary service providers across the EU internal market. One very crucial thing that it happens with this regulation is that two new legal subjects have been established. So, and these two legal subjects are very large online platforms and very large search engines. An example of very large online platform is Facebook, Meta, and very large search engine is Google search, for example. So these are platforms that have more than 45 million monthly active users in the EU. And if they are defined as such, if they fall under this definition, they have been entrusted by a specific duty of care by the DSA. So what do they need to do is to conduct periodical assessments of systemic risks. This is provided under Article 34 of the regulation, and to run also periodical, to undertake periodical mitigation measures of these risks. So what does it mean to assess the risks? It means that every year these platforms need to take into account if the design of their service, so how a platform is designed, also considering the algorithmic systems that they use, if this is posing threats to the so-called systemic risks. So if this is posing threats to freedom of expression, to media pluralism, to the right to an informed citizenship, to electoral integrity, and the list that you can read here: public health, public security, also mental well-being. This is very important, I believe. So what this regulation attempts to do is to require more attention by very large online platforms and search engines into the design of their own systems. And if they identify that some of these systemic risks are at stake, to put in place mitigation measures, so to modify the design of their own platforms. So is this a paradigm change in the regulation of the relationship between news and online platforms and users and online platforms? Well, on one side it is, because it establishes these new legal subjects and it is requiring to them some specific obligations which we could not even think about 20 years ago. And it increases also transparency obligations for them, and also the possibility to access data from platforms by researchers. But one of the main critics that are moved to these regulations, especially to Article 18 of the Media Freedom Act and to the DSA that we just looked into, is that it externalizes the actual implementation of these practices to these private companies. So it relies on the good faith, basically, of these big platforms to report the correct data, to meaningfully engage with the news outlets when moderating their content, to meaningfully assess their own systemic risks. And finally, one of the critics also that are moved to these regulations is that the editorial role of these platforms is only indirectly regulated, so that it could have been more meaningful to be kind of more courageous and admit that deciding the relevance of distribution of content, the dissemination of content in online platforms is in itself an editorial activity. And on this, I would open a bit the discussion with you. I floated you with information. Also, if some question comes to your mind in a second moment, please feel always free to write to me. And in the meanwhile, while you maybe share your thoughts, I will link in the chat the report on media pluralism in Ukraine that I was mentioning earlier. Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate all your arts.
Do we have some questions, guys?
So I share with you the link in the chat. As you will see, our report on Ukraine looks into some of the dimensions that I was mentioning from our media pluralism report. And I would really appreciate if you have some feedback or you want to, get in touch and signal some specific information that you deem it's missing there. I know you are a very talented young professional, so I'm sure that a lot of good inputs would come from you. And also maybe while we see if there is some question, I would like to share with you another opportunity that you might want to consider. Every year since 12 years, we run a summer school for journalists, but also policymakers, mainly journalists, but sometimes we have had some policymakers here in Florence. It usually takes place in the last 2 weeks of June. It is fully funded, going through an application process, of course. And here it is. In 1 month, the new call will come out, and it is open to Ukrainian citizens as well. You might want to check it out and to join us in Florence in June.
Thanks for sharing.
You're very welcome.
I hope that some of our participants will be really motivated to apply.
Absolutely.
Because I know from our first group of participants, because now it's our second cohort, that they applied for some event, kind of school that was held in September, if I'm not mistaken. Lorenzo was responsible for that. I do not know the issue, but I know that they had that interest, so probably they are still motivated, because we will share this link not only with this cohort, but also with another one. That
Yes,
is
great.
our
Absolutely.
alumni, let's say. Yeah,
Mhm.
thanks.
Thanks to you. Also, if you want, I can share my slides later if you think it is useful, or
Yeah, it might be a nice
because
idea.
I guess if I understood correctly, today you had many hours of lessons, so you might be a bit tired now, but maybe you want to go through this in a later moment.
Yeah, that's an issue because usually we have 2 lectures on Wednesday, and the second one, sometimes it's the last one. So yeah, it feels like they might be tired. And
I
now we have
understand.
some limitations with electricity, etc. So it's not also easy to be well connected. Sometimes you can hear, but you can't turn on your camera, or you have these disconnections very often. So that's kind of challenge
Yeah.
we have. That's why we're recording all our lectures, to give an
Absolutely.
opportunity to watch them afterwards. So no questions at all. Okay, then if we do not have questions, then we should say thank you for, first of all, that you accepted that invitation, that you joined us instead of Eva, because actually I met Eva in Florence in June this year, because I had 10 days kind of research trip there. That's why this connection happened, as well as with Constanza and Veronica Anvil and some other colleagues. But yeah, thank you that you were with us, and we are looking forward for future collaboration, because we are going to
Yes.
have third cohort of our project. So let's stay in touch.
Same
And
here, same here. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to spend this hour with you and to share some of our results. And please, yes, get in touch anytime. You're very welcome.
yes, thank you, Sofia.
Ciao.
Oh yeah,
Have a good
ciao.
evening. Bye
Yeah,
bye.
you too. Bye bye.